The Holocaust, a name that echoes through history, carrying with it the weight of incomprehensible loss and unthinkable suffering. It was a time when the world stood silent as the worst atrocities unfolded. 6 million Jews were killed, alongside millions of others, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and countless innocents. But those numbers barely scratch the surface. What happened during this time was simply not the physical toll of war. It was a monstrous assault on humanity. This video isn't just a recount of events. This is a stark, unflinching examination of the horrors, survival, and resistance that took place. In these dark chapters, stories are buried, truths are concealed, and horrors are forgotten. Today, we lift the veil and peer into the depths of that darkness. We'll uncover the hidden atrocities, reveal the unimaginable pain, and remember the heroes who fought back in the face of utter despair. We begin with the rise of the SS and the twisted ideology that gave birth to one of the deadliest regimes in history. It is a chilling reminder that the darkest of evils can rise when hatred is allowed to flourish unchecked. This is not just history. This is the truth that some are still unwilling to confront. The formation of the SS marked the beginning of a dark chapter in human history. Created by Heinrich Himmler in 1925, the Schutzstaffel, translated to Protection Squadron, was intended to safeguard Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. But its true purpose soon shifted from mere bodyguards to the most feared and ruthless enforcers of Nazi policies. Under Himmler's leadership, the SS grew into a powerful force, enforcing laws that targeted Jews, Roma, the disabled, and any group deemed undesirable by the regime. They were not only the police force of the Third Reich, but the architects of mass terror. Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's right-hand man, was one of the key figures behind the execution of the final solution, the systematic extermination of the Jewish people. Then there was Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, who conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners. His name would become synonymous with human experimentation, his experiments leaving behind countless victims whose suffering went unnoticed for years. The SS was far more than just a police force. It was the backbone of the Nazi regime, the force that hunted down resistance, terrorized communities, and instilled fear in every corner of Europe. The machinery of death was under their control, with the power to eliminate, erase, and dominate. They carried out the final solution, initiating mass killings through gas chambers, shootings, and starvation. Not only did they sought to exterminate Jews, but anyone who posed a threat to their vision of racial purity. The SS hunted the innocent with cold precision, creating a climate of fear and control. Through surveillance, threats, and intimidation, the SS ensured that no one dared defy the Nazi vision. It was a terrifying force, a machine of death and destruction, that began to unfold across Europe as the world turned a blind eye. But this was only the beginning. As the war escalated, the true scale of their operation would unfold in ways no one could imagine. In September 1939, the world was thrust into a conflict unlike any the world had ever seen before. The outbreak of World War II was a tipping point, a global crisis that brought untold destruction, death, and suffering. But amidst the chaos of bombings and bloodshed, something darker took root. The Nazi regime under Adolf Hitler saw the war as an opportunity to reshape Europe and impose their ruthless ideology on the world, and what followed was nothing short of catastrophic. The war gave birth to a new kind of violence, a violence that was not just physical, but ideological. As Nazi forces swept through Europe, they unleashed not just military conquest, but a systematic campaign of racial and ethnic purification. Entire countries were occupied, and it was here, in the occupied territories, that the groundwork for the Holocaust was laid. The Nazi government sought to eliminate Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, and anyone who didn't fit into their twisted vision of a racially pure society. But it wasn't just the invading soldiers who posed a threat. The Nazi regime's control over propaganda was unmatched. Through controlled media, the Nazi regime spread hate, lies, and fear. Jews, Roma, and other minority groups were depicted as vermin, responsible for every ill of society. This dehumanization made it easier for ordinary people to look the other way, and for others to pick up arms in the name of purification. As the war unfolded, more and more people fell under the sway of Nazi rhetoric. Anti-Semitic propaganda poisoned the minds of millions, turning once compassionate individuals into willing participants in the horrors that followed. The lies spread by Hitler's government sought to separate Jews from the rest of society. They were no longer seen as human. They were subhuman, vermin, a threat to the nation. At the core of the Nazi campaign was Lebensraum, or living space, a concept that justified the violent expansion of German territory across Europe. According to this ideology, the land was for the superior German people, and anyone who lived there, particularly the Jews, were seen as a barrier to that vision. Entire populations were displaced, starved, or eradicated as the Nazis carved out their vision of Europe. Hitler's vision wasn't just about conquest. It was about erasing entire peoples from the earth, replacing them with a nation of his design. Every conquered city, every town, every village that fell under Nazi control became a place of suffering. The Germans didn't just invade, they took lives, erased cultures, and destroyed communities. And as the war progressed, so too did the scale of their atrocities. The Nazis, now in full control of vast parts of Europe, would go on to build death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, where millions of innocent people were sent to be killed in the most inhumane ways imaginable. And this is where the Nazi regime's evil reached its peak. It was not enough to simply control. They wanted to annihilate, to destroy entire populations, to eradicate not the Jews alone, but entire races. They turned these camps into industrialized killing machines, where the final solution was carried out with cold efficiency. The brutality, the scale, the cruelty, no one could have ever imagined the horrors that would unfold in these camps. The name Auschwitz sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. Located in occupied Poland, it became the largest and most infamous of all Nazi death camps. What was once a place of relative isolation for prisoners quickly turned into a hellscape. Originally designed as a forced labor camp, it would soon become the cornerstone of the Nazis' systematic genocide, the final solution. It was here, in this sprawling nightmare, that millions of lives were destroyed, wiped from existence. Built to handle a scale of brutality beyond imagination, Auschwitz became the very symbol of what happens when hatred is allowed to flourish unchecked. It wasn't just about the killing, it was the sheer efficiency of it. The Nazis perfected mass murder here, turning death into an industrial operation. Prisoners were not just executed, they were dehumanized, reduced to nothing more than numbers, their names forgotten as soon as they arrived. The moment they arrived, the horrors began. The infamous selection process determined who would live and who would die. Those who were deemed unfit for forced labor, elderly, children, the sick, were sent straight to the gas chambers. The rest, those deemed fit, were used for the most grueling labor imaginable, working to death under the watchful eyes of SS guards who took pleasure in their torment. Among the survivors of Auschwitz are names that would forever be etched into history. One such name was Elie Wiesel, a young man who would survive this hell and go on to document the suffering he witnessed. His words and others like him would serve as the testimony to the unspeakable atrocities that occurred within those gates. The camp was a machine designed for death. Gas chambers, crematoriums, and medical experiments were not only routine, they were institutionalized. Dr. Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, performed horrifying experiments on prisoners. Some were subjected to injections, others were tortured in ways that were deemed medically unethical, all in the name of twisted science. These experiments, performed on men, women, and children, served no other purpose but to satisfy the sadistic desires of those in charge. Life within the camp was nothing short of unbearable. Overcrowded barracks, barely enough food to sustain life, and the constant threat of death shadowed every waking moment. Disease spread like wildfire, taking the lives of many before they even had the chance to face the gas chambers. Those who survived the physical toll of Auschwitz were forever marked by the horrors they endured. But some didn't survive at all. They were broken before they could even hope for escape. The atrocities that occurred at Auschwitz were not just numbers in a history book. They were real people, real lives, all cut short by the machinery of death that operated with ruthless efficiency. This was the true face of the Holocaust, the destruction of innocence, the erasure of identity, the stripping away of every ounce of humanity. It was the middle of the night when the knock on the door came. But for millions, it wasn't just a knock. It was the sound of lives being shattered, families being torn apart forever. Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, all rounded up, stripped of their rights, and forced onto trains bound for an unknown destination. The air was thick with fear, uncertainty hanging over every family. No one knew where they were going. No one knew if they would ever see their homes again. But they had no choice. The orders were clear, and the destination was already decided. As the trains began their endless journey across Europe, families were packed into cattle cars with no room to breathe, no space to move. The windows, if they existed at all, were covered in filth, leaving them to suffocate in the oppressive heat. The sound of screams from children, crying for food and water, became a constant. There was no way to escape the crushing weight of the heat, the smell, the suffocating darkness. The trains became a moving tomb, filled with the living and the dying, all uncertain of what awaited them at the end of the tracks. Even before reaching their final destination, the horror had begun. Families who had once lived together, shared meals together, and dreamed of a better life were suddenly ripped apart. Men, women, children, separated, shoved into different compartments, each carrying only their most precious belongings, the few items that were allowed. But there were no promises, no guarantees of safety, no chance to say goodbye. In the ghettos, things were no better. Overcrowding, hunger, and disease ravaged the people who had been forced into these confined spaces. Families who had once lived in their homes were now herded like cattle, their futures uncertain, their identities erased. Starvation became the cruelest of punishments. Every day was a battle just to stay alive, and yet amid the chaos, the hopelessness, the silence of the trains, there was one constant: the desperate hope that somehow, maybe, they would survive. Survivors have spoken of the terror they felt during these deportations. Some say it was the endless uncertainty. Others say it was the brutality of being separated from loved ones that haunted them the most. Children ripped from their mothers, fathers lost to the winds, and families who could never say goodbye. And the worst part? Not knowing where they were going, what fate awaited them. Was there any hope, or was this just the beginning of their final journey? As the trains reached their final destination, the concentration camps, they were greeted not with safety, but with terror. The sheer scale of extermination was beyond comprehension. The trains were emptied, and the prisoners who survived the journey were forced into a hell of torture, starvation, and unimaginable cruelty. The horror had only just begun. The death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, each became a place where life had no value. These weren't just camps, they were factories of death, places where the machinery of mass murder worked with horrific precision. In the name of a twisted ideology, millions were systematically exterminated, their lives erased without a trace. The Nazis didn't simply kill, they engineered death, a cold, calculated, and efficient machine designed to eliminate entire populations. At first glance, they seemed like normal camps, barracks, fences, guards, but the reality was anything but ordinary. The methods used to kill were barbaric, but also disturbingly organized. Gas chambers, disguised as showers, became the first stop for many. Families, children, the elderly, men and women, all lured into the gas chambers under the pretense of cleansing. They were stripped of their identities and herded to their deaths. The gas, the panic, and the suffocating air were the last things they ever felt. The bodies were then disposed of in mass graves or incinerated in crematoriums. Those who survived the gas chambers, if they were lucky enough to survive the selection, faced a slow death through forced labor, working until their bones broke and their bodies gave way to exhaustion. The brutality didn't end with death. After the murders, the Nazis took steps to hide the evidence of their crimes. Bodies were burned, and mass graves were dug up and replaced with fresh soil. The goal was simple: to erase any trace of what happened, to bury the truth beneath layers of earth and lies, as if millions of lives could be forgotten just like that. But what the Nazis didn't account for was the sheer will to survive, even in the face of annihilation. In the face of such terror, there were still those who fought back. The Sonderkommando, the forced labor units, were tasked with the unspeakable, handling the bodies of the dead, burning the corpses, and disposing of the evidence of genocide. These men, already on the edge of their humanity, were the unwilling witnesses to the horrors in the camps. But some did fight back. Some rebelled against their captors. They couldn't stop the killing, but they could expose it. They left behind accounts, testimonies, and stories that would be crucial in bringing the truth to light. The resistance wasn't just a physical fight. It was a fight for memory, a fight to make sure that the horrors weren't erased from history. And then there was Treblinka. Its role in the Holocaust is one of the most notorious. The scale of the killings there was unimaginable. Over 1 million people lost their lives, often within just a few weeks of arrival. The camp's remoteness, its hidden location in the forest, made it an ideal site for mass extermination. Those who arrived there were greeted by the terrifying sight of what seemed like an ordinary train station, but it was a station to death. The Nazis had perfected the art of deception, luring people into the camp with promises of safety. But when they entered, they were met with horror, gas chambers, executions, and the obliteration of life. And for the few who survived, their stories became the silent screams that haunt us to this day. The vast scale of the deportations is something few can truly comprehend. Millions of innocent lives torn from their homes, transported like cattle, herded into the unknown. Entire families, entire communities, displaced in a way that seemed unnatural, as if the very concept of home was being erased. The trains, packed to the brim, carried them across Europe, but they were not taking them to safety. No, these trains were moving to a place where death awaited, a place where the word escape was meaningless. The prisoners didn't know where they were going. Most never saw the light of day again. These weren't just individuals. They were the very foundation of communities, forced into a nightmare beyond imagination. From the streets of Warsaw to the small villages in Lithuania and Hungary, entire Jewish populations were ripped away from the lives they knew. The Nazis didn't just take away their homes, they took away their dignity, their hope, their families. The displaced were herded into ghettos before the trains came to take them. Children were torn from their mothers, husbands from wives. They were left to wonder, with no answers, why they were being uprooted, why their lives were being reduced to nothing more than a series of numbers. The trains became a symbol of despair. It wasn't just the crowded, suffocating space inside, but the uncertainty. For those who survived the journey, it was not the end, but the beginning of a fate far worse. The cramped conditions were unbearable. People could barely stand, let alone sit. There was no ventilation, no escape from the stench of sweat, human waste, and the collective fear that radiated from every prisoner. The cries of children, the pleading of the elderly, it all mixed with the silence of those who had already given up. They knew that death was not just coming, it had already arrived. But the most harrowing part of it all was that they didn't know what awaited them. The faces of the people being forced into those cattle cars were filled with confusion, fear, and sometimes an aching hope that somehow they would be taken to safety. But instead, the camps awaited them: Treblinka, Auschwitz, Dachau, places where extermination was a system, not an accident. The process was methodical, cruel, and efficient. No one escaped, not without suffering, and the toll it took on those who survived was unimaginable. Many survivors were unable to speak of their experiences for decades, the weight of the memories too heavy to bear. The survivors, those who managed to keep their wits in the face of absolute horror, tell us what it was like. The emotional cost of seeing their families wiped out, of watching their communities erased, is a pain no one could understand unless they lived it. And as the trains kept coming, the number of lives lost only grew, the scale of it stretching beyond what any human mind could fathom. But there was one camp, one place where it all came together, where the horror was perfected. And that place was Treblinka. Treblinka wasn't just another death camp. It was an extermination camp designed specifically for mass murder. There, the machinery of death was perfected. Unlike the other camps, where some survived for a while before being killed, Treblinka was a place where nearly everyone who arrived was condemned from the moment they stepped off the train. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, there were those who fought back. people who, against all reason, found the courage to resist, to stand up against the annihilation machine that surrounded them. It was an act of defiance, even if it was only temporary. The atmosphere in Treblinka was thick with the stench of death, the echoes of suffering that had reached their breaking point. It wasn't just another concentration camp. It was the very definition of hell on earth. More than 870,000 innocent lives were wiped out here. But despite the sheer scale of the horror, something remarkable happened. A group of prisoners, those with nothing left to lose, did what seemed impossible. They rose up. They fought back. For years, the camp had been a well-oiled machine of mass murder. The gas chambers, the crematoriums, the bodies stacked high, they were part of the everyday routine. The prisoners were part of that machinery, but they weren't just bodies waiting to die. They were people, and somewhere deep inside, the fire of defiance burned. In August of 1943, that fire ignited into a full-blown rebellion. The Treblinka uprising had begun. These men, desperate, broken, yet still filled with something that kept them going, had somehow gathered the strength to rise. They had been planning for months, whispering in the dark, building their resistance. When the day came, it wasn't just a physical attack. It was an act of defiance that shattered the camp's perfect image of death. They set fire to the camp, sabotaged the infrastructure, and tried to break free. They fought with whatever they had, blades, tools, anything they could get their hands on. But the revolt was short-lived. The Nazis responded quickly, brutally. Hundreds of prisoners were gunned down, and the survivors were rounded up and executed. Despite the violent suppression, some of the rebels managed to escape, their lives forever marked by the horrors they had witnessed and the trauma of the hell they had survived. The ones who fled were hunted, driven to the brink of madness, and though they managed to survive physically, their souls never truly escaped the grip of Treblinka. Even after the flames of rebellion had been extinguished, Treblinka continued to operate, a machine of death that crushed the hopes of all who entered. The men who escaped, those who lived, carried the weight of the past with them. The stories they told, the memories they shared, they were testaments to the courage and the pain of those who dared to fight for their lives, even when everything seemed lost. And while Treblinka was one of the most brutal, it was not the only camp where such uprisings occurred. Resistance wasn't just a flash of rebellion in the face of certain death. It became a thread woven through the fabric of the Holocaust, a thread that tied the survivors to each other, a thread of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. From the ashes of Treblinka, a message rang out. Death couldn't claim them all. Even in the most hopeless of situations, the human spirit finds ways to fight back. In the darkest corners of Nazi-occupied Europe, a few courageous souls dared to defy their captors. These uprisings were not just acts of desperation. They were a declaration of survival, a refusal to be erased from history. The prisoners of the Warsaw Ghetto and Sobibor were not merely fighting for their lives, but for the memory of their people, for revenge, and for the world to know that they were more than just victims. They were fighters. The resistance movements, though small in number, were bold beyond measure. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for example, erupted in the spring of 1943 as a desperate group of Jews, backed by a handful of fighters, fought against the German forces. Armed with little more than a few rifles and homemade weapons, they held out against the Nazis for weeks. Weeks that shook the foundation of the German regime's control. Despite the eventual fall of the ghetto, the courage displayed by those in the uprising reverberated through the walls of ghettos, camps, and mines far beyond the ghetto's confines. In Sobibor, the prisoners did what was thought impossible. A revolt broke out in the camp on October 14, 1943. A small group of Soviet POWs and Jewish prisoners managed to overpower the guards, destroy the camp's infrastructure, and free many of their fellow prisoners. Though the Nazis swiftly retaliated, executing many of the escapees, the very fact that such an uprising occurred became a symbol of resistance. It proved that the oppressed, even with nothing to lose, could bring the machinery of genocide to a halt, if only for a fleeting moment. These uprisings, though ultimately unsuccessful in the broader sense, became a symbol of hope and defiance. They gave those imprisoned a reason to resist, a reason to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. They proved that even in the bleakest of times, even in a place built for extermination, there was still the will to fight back. That spark of defiance spread to others in the camps, and the fire it started could never be fully extinguished. As the Holocaust came to its bitter end in 1945, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The horrors they endured, the horrors we still try to comprehend today, have left scars that cannot be erased. For those who lived through it, life would never return to what it once was. The trauma, the loss, the weight of history, they carried that burden with them, shaping the generations to come. The world could never be the same. Yet the survivors persevered. They rebuilt their lives, carried on the stories, and became the witnesses to a nightmare that we must never forget. The Holocaust is not just a part of history, it is a powerful reminder, a warning of what humanity is capable of when hatred and prejudice go unchecked. The world must remain vigilant, always. We must learn from the mistakes of the past to ensure that no one is ever subjected to such horrors again. The legacy of the Holocaust is not just one of suffering. It is a legacy of survival, resilience, and the will to remember. It is a call to action. We must never forget the lessons of the past. We must continue to educate future generations to ensure that we never repeat the atrocities that led to this dark chapter in our history. Today, we stand as the custodians of those memories. We must carry them forward for the survivors, for the lost, and for humanity itself. Never forget. We owe it to those who perished and to those who survived to ensure that their stories are never silenced. Let us remember, share the stories, keep their memory alive. And as we carry forward the weight of the past, may we never forget the lessons that come from the darkest chapters of history. Only then can we ensure that such horrors are never repeated.